Thank you so much for having us. I'm really happy to be here with Cécile. I think we worked first time together on the show Inhuman, maybe a different kind of perspective than today. Shall we start with the film, or?
Yeah, we thought before jumping into things, we'd just show maybe the first minute and a half of the video that's actually, I finished a few days ago and is on view in Statements. It's called Amos's World, Episode 1. Real.
How do I do it? I try to think about what I want. I want to build something important. That's not right. I want to change the world. It sounds wrong when I say it out loud. I want to express myself, but I can't find the words. I draw a line from where I'm feeling to what I want, where I want things to be. And that's my plan. I don't know what the plan is.
Surely someone has asked you about the plan.
My intentions.
Great, thank you.
I think if you know Cécile's work, for me it's quite obvious that there's quite a shift now in your work, and maybe you can begin explaining us why you start to be interested in architecture, which is somehow the main topic of that new film.
Yeah, I mean, I knew I wanted to use something that would be quite classic, but also, and that would feel somehow distant to certain things now, or some of the things that I've more directly worked with, like technology, but so that that could actually serve as an abstraction or an allegory for those things. And I was coming on the heels of like 3 big projects, which really all kind of ended in this like loss of control, or this kind of chaos, or the breakdown of a system. And I thought, because now we're really living that, we are kind of living in the collapse of the, the largest ideologies of the last decades. It felt good to go back, and also to really anchor it in a physicality, to really underscore, yes, I'm still working in a moving image medium with installation, but to really, again, underscore this idea that there is no such thing as virtuality, that the digital and the physical are the same thing, and that all of these realities that we're coming up against all exist within one thing that we have to reconcile with. And I thought that the systems of architecture, here you heard this idea of the plan, which you heard from Le Corbusier with his master plan. These, to me, were kind of like very clear, concrete blueprints of like ideas that how to make society better, I guess, if that makes sense.
I think, unfortunately, the whole idea, like 3 days ago, we had that burning skyscraper in London, and I think it raised a lot of social questions, and I think that's a social question, how we can live together in architecture. And I think the interesting thing about brutalism architecture is that most of this building, unfortunately, don't function really like social buildings. So, because you're talking also a lot about separation, and also the question why in I think a lot of cities nowadays, it's even a lot of people really love to live in, and there's a new generation and a different kind of gentrification happening, I think, especially in London.
Yeah, I mean, specifically with Brutalism, to me, that period of architecture was the greatest discrepancy between the intentions of the architect and the architect's ambitions. For example, Amos, the puppet, who is the architect, he's based on a number of architects, but namely Le Corbusier and an architect called Peter Smithson, who built Robin Hood Gardens in London. And him and his wife, Alison, really had this intention of bringing kind of the hardness of the North to the soft people of the South. And famously were deeply disappointed when the behaviors of the tenants didn't meet the architect's expectations. And I think, I mean, what's happening in London, I think, is a very, very different object that has to do with the failure of government and the social being implicitly political. But for me, that looking back to that period of time, because also I live next to these buildings. I live next to Balfron Tower, which is currently being decanted, as they call it, and the former residence being left so that it can be turned into luxury apartments. And the moment at which you realize that the ambitions of the architect, perhaps, for a better society were just the ambitions that he or she had for themselves. And kind of the inability for that to translate to other people's realities.
Yeah, I think this is a huge question that in a certain way you have all these apartments in these buildings, but they are separate and everybody's talking about the loneliness, and you introduce in your film different kind of realities. So there's a puppet which you just seen, the architect, but there's also, you've seen the flowers as part of the animation, and then you have real actors. What was the reason to introduce this different kind of realities inside one film?
Yeah, I mean, I've always seen all of these different things, like combining real footage with animated footage that I've made myself, things that I filmed myself, or like computer renderings, to see all of these things existing on a single plane. And then this, I don't know how many of you have seen the work that's on, but in order to watch the video, you have to sit inside one of 6 individual viewing cubes. If we could actually get the picture of the image of the building up, that would be wonderful. And with that, I really wanted to have a visitor experience this thing of when you see these individual viewing cubes, you assume you're each going to be watching something different. And the moment at which you get inside and realize that you're all looking at the same thing, but from very different viewpoints. And also for these characters to all be anchored in this same kind of storyline, but to have very different and distinct materials and materialities and their own sets of problems. Yeah.
Like looking out of a skyscraper, we all have the same perspective, but on the other hand, I thought you also do somehow the same than the architect, because in order to see your film, you're also forced to get into, and then I don't know when you've been in, it's quite dense, it's quite small, and yeah, it's really getting a physical feeling being in an apartment like that.
And it does something to your body, which architects, there's a book called The Architect's Data, which has cataloged just like the standardized shape of a woman's body, the standardized shape of a man's body, you know, the dimensions of what it means to sit down, the dimensions even of pigs and goats and things like that. And I mean, I like to think that the cubes are kind of comfortable because they have pillows and it's dark. But at the same time, that was 100% part of the intentionality, was like, so that you fit inside of the building as opposed to, you know, navigating a large white cube scenario.
I think we also talked about that, for example, when 1926, there were the Frankfurter Kitchen conceived. Also, I think that was a moment also like this functional, the working life already, then also to functionalize the private life. And is this also a reason going back to this kind of architecture to also to see the moment where we are living now, like optimizing our bodies and everything is controlled, to see that maybe the starting point of all that is the modernity?
I mean, the Frankfurter Kitchen, we talked about it, was a huge point of reference if we're talking about the failure of an ideology that was meant to help people. Just to give some backstory, it was created after the war because women were working, and so their position in the family was starting to be questioned, and also there was a lot of stress of having to perform both roles. So it was a female architect called...
her name was Margarete Schlüter-Lizotzky.
Yeah, who created...
Lizotzky, sorry.
Yeah, who like really kind of kitted out the kitchen so that it was like the sugar was here and you only had to make so many steps to like go here. But a lot of feminist theory later on really heavily criticized this because it meant it was really for not only just a specific kind of woman's body, but it meant that it reinforced the woman's place in the kitchen. There was no room for the man to come and not help, but participate in those kinds of chores. And this reminded me so much of the research that we talked about for Inhuman, and speaking with people in the tech community, and also this very old, not so old idiom compared to the Frankfurter Kitchen, but this idea we shape our tools and thereafter they shape us. So even if there's a good intention to the tool, the moment at which there becomes this kind of Ouroboros, this kind of entropic animal or cycle within society where you have to conform to the thing, which we very much have done with social media and the way that we exchange and disseminate information and like more specifically our feelings and the impact that that has.
Yeah, I also think that in the way we are, for example, I mean, this is also an interesting fact in your work that there's also a Chinese woman, an actor, who's there and who's talking to her mother, which is a swallow, a bird, and maybe such only as a fiction. And I thought, and maybe I'm totally wrong, but I thought like going to Beijing, for example, we have all, this architecture, but I think it seems to me even more brutal without the history that somehow I think if you go now the Bauhaus, I think they were still taking an account, even if they also wanted to make it more practical, they really relate more to the individual and to the body of the individual. And I think that sometimes if this history is not even there, it's only functional, it's only capitalized, and nothing else seems to be...
Well, yeah, I mean, the idea of like an individual communal living society or situation, that was kind of in all of these socially progressive housing ideas, and also exporting that to China being somehow quite strange. I shot the scenes in Beijing in an architect called Stephen Hall's Linked Hybrid, which was a sort of upgraded or updated version of Le Corbusier's Streets in the Sky. And this idea, something that I can't, part of the reason I made this is that I really couldn't reconcile this idea of individuals have, like the community or the communal living aspect is kind of codependent on there being individuals all having this collective experience, but the collective experience then becoming this singular entity, as opposed to kind of the recognition of a collection of experiences that all exist simultaneously. But the mother and the bird, that's like a whole other sort of layer. And I knew I wanted to shoot something in Beijing and in China because of how quickly a lot of modernity and contemporary architecture has been kind of exported and imposed in there, but also because that character is meant to be an actress and her mother, and I kind of wanted to get out as well, away from the idea of just like American celebrity, which is something that's been in previous works, but to really dig in more towards this idea of projections and the projection of the image as an object, and like how then does someone who is completely enclosed in this like singular structure then how are they able to deal with the multiple projections of themselves, which is something we are facing with digital media and the dissemination of the self.
Yeah, and I think also like the separation of everybody, because you said also that I did once a show it called One on One, and all the works were in the exhibition were produced for one viewer, and you could only enter the space alone, and it was the works were playing with that idea, and I showed there also work by Tobias Seloni. And one really young critic came up to me and then he said, yeah, but you always watch movie alone. And I didn't really understood him and said, huh? And then I realized, yeah, I'm still thinking when I watch a movie, I'm thinking of the cinema, which is still a collective experience. But I think nowadays, I think it is right that everybody watch movies alone, and also mean that you're alone with your experience and also with your thoughts, and also as a community, you still act out of a solipsistic movement even.
But that exhibition was obviously a huge reference point for me because I went to it and it gave me a lot of confidence with this idea of really separating things. Because I've always found it very weird watching video art. Like you go into this room with other people and there's no kind of like real beginning and end, and like where do you put your body within this? And I know that there are other artists, I think Philippe Perrenot at some point has this virtual reality piece where you can actually erase everyone else in the thing and also erase your own body and experience the exhibition without the sort of like having to deal with it. But I didn't want to do that because I constantly myself have to deal with my own body. But I remember going to see Jeremy Shaw's work in the one-to-one, and just the amazingness of like, for the piece to watch the video actually began when you sat down on the seat, right? It activated the video to begin. And just this sense of also understanding that someone had watched this before me and someone had watched this after me, someone maybe was waiting, and then wondering, like, is my experience of this going to be the same as that person? And asking my friends, like, what happened when you went into it? And together we started to sort of piece together this experience. And this felt very organic and natural, as opposed to this assumption that we had all seen the same thing.
I think that was somehow nice about the show, that people, because they were in queues, they were starting to talk about the pieces they've seen, the works they haven't seen, and there was a quite interaction between audience which normally don't really interact. But I think you're right. For example, I always see like totally dynamics when you go into a black box. If somebody is the first person sits down on the floor, the second will do the same, the third. If several people move, more people will move out. It's a total dynamic which happens.
It
always.
also places the focus on communication about it. Like, for example, one thing I've really loved at the fair actually is I've heard stories of people in the individual cubes texting each other. So at certain moments in the video saying like, oh, did you see this? Did you get that? There's like a love story and saying like, oh, is the person she's talking about actually the woman in this apartment? And like beginning to find, this is episode 1, by the way, and like spoiler alert, episode 2 is all about how they start to kind of find a different way to use the structure of the building or to use the network to communicate better amongst themselves, as opposed to being dependent on how it was actually built or what they have available to them. So it's been like pretty sick to see that just happening and people understanding that naturally. And people also starting to maybe like lean out a little bit outside of their window to see if they can see somebody else's elbow and things like that. And I used to live, when I lived in Berlin, I had an apartment on Memhardstraße. It's called the Memi Monster. It's like a brutalist copy from just like the end of the Stasi era. And it's 2 huge tower blocks that are facing each other. And I could always see like the teenager hanging out the window smoking. And I mean, this is also like a classic trope in cinema. And it's also a feeling that I definitely feel online as well in a different way. Like I have a Google Doc on my website that's just open that anyone can contribute to. I put my notes there, other people write messages and things. But you can, the way that it's set up, you can see when other people are on the page. And you can see them typing things simultaneously. So this feeling of being very, very much alone and feeling that loneliness, but an awareness that other people somehow are going through something at the same time, simultaneously.
I wanted also to talk about, there's the flowers who are terrorists, maybe.
Well, they've joined, there's an epilogue at the end that clarifies this. They've joined an organization called the Rainbow Connection, which was based on some research that I did of because I live in London and people are really beginning to organize in an amazing way. There's an organization called NELMA, Northeast London Migrants Association. And especially with the events that have happened this week and with the election, things are getting very radical in a necessary way. People are recognizing that they're allowed to fight for their freedom. And the secretary in the video who lives with these three flowers who then go on the run, the media reports that they've joined a listed terrorist organization, which I was very clear to say listed, because a lot of times these radical left organizations get positioned in a certain way, maybe because of the class or the race of the people involved in it. But so, sorry, what was your question about them?
No, I just also, I think I would like to come later on also this resistant moment, which I think is really important. But I also thought in the moment this flower shows up in this architecture to realize there is no nature and there's also no space for nature. And then they talk about the bees and I think what role nature played for you in that?
Huge. I mean, I visited everywhere that was filmed here. I actually went and visited. So I am Pays City Hall in Dallas. One place that didn't make it into the video but was incredibly formative was Moishe Safdie's Habitat 67 for the 67 Montreal Expo. And in order to visit, I really wanted to see the apartments and see the way of life. So I contacted a real estate agent and told him I wanted to buy one of them. Of course, no, I can't. But very few people can now. But to understand what was the day-to-day of these people, and they had what really struck me, which I had always thought was a myth, was that they had a local shop actually inside the building. Where it's run by this couple that not only just stocks the store with what the tenants, many of whom have lived there for almost 50 years now, specifically what they want, which reminds me so much of Amazon, constantly reminding me to buy a vacuum cleaner, even though I already have a vacuum cleaner. And the idea that if I order almond milk once, the store will always restock it with almond milk. And she can make you pizzas if you want a pizza or a chicken rotisserie. And I thought the only time I ever leave the house when I'm working is go to the grocery store. And suddenly I recognized all of these windows, these square windows of these huge structures. Always the selling point from the real estate agent was you have a view onto the water, you have a view onto this, but you had none of that. Everything was built for you to stay inside. And Le Corbusier actually says this in his master plan. I also paraphrase this, the architect says it. I have the distinct job not only of containing men, women, and children, but also of retaining them, because they couldn't be trusted to be out on the streets. He really saw leisure as this problem. And again, it also very much reminded me of the language of a startup company who builds an app, and how Facebook's task is not just to get you information so that you can be liberated and go out onto the streets and do something with it, but their main job is to keep you there and to keep you with that information, to not just to contain you and to captivate you, but really to keep you there as long as possible in an active paralysis.
And also to control you there. Yes. And I think part of glass, glass gives you a view which can be interesting, but also you are able to control the teenager on the other side of the building. It's also control, I think, always.
Of course. I mean, many of these architects were huge control freaks and had very specific ways if they thought of how people should live. Like Peter Smithson, again, there's this quote, there's this moment at which like it was clear his project was, and his ambitions for the housing estate were really beginning to fail. And he has this statement where he didn't like how people were disposing of their garbage. He didn't like the smell of their cooking. I mean, like, you know? And then there was this shift where there's a quote from him that I had to dig very deep to find, where he says, if it has to be grotesque, it must be spectacular. And also this idea of legacy from these, whether it's an architect or a politician, I think you really see this in the American administration at the moment, this sort of, and also within our industry, within the arts, of like, when everything feels, when you don't have a singular answer, you start to fetishize or drive towards this idea of destruction as like a unifying symbol, as almost like a joy. And this really, like the joy of unity through tragedy, I guess. And you see this with the media really kind of putting and pushing this forward. And this deeply, deeply disturbs me. And that was very much something I wanted to try to explore through that character.
You also see really much the difference between the architecture, the way he's living, which is somehow such a typical, I don't know, there could be a guide of typical architecture apartments, because in a certain way they all look the same. And then the apartment he built in, where he may never ever lived himself, and this huge difference, talking about himself all the time, and then trying to get a social solution for housing. It doesn't really go together.
Yeah, I mean, quite intentionally, I filmed Amos, the fictional architect. You always see him in this architect's apartment, which is actually Erno Goldfinger, who built the Brutalist Towers in London, Trellick Tower and Balfron Tower. It is his apartment, which has been purchased by the National Trust of England, and generously they allowed me to film there. But the irony is that it's, and an image will come up at some point, for someone who built his career out of building these cement tower blocks and this ominous presence. His entire apartment is lined in wood and is full of warmth and a real, that's him crying in his bathtub. And is completely different. But what I learned, interestingly, it's at 2 Willow Road. I strongly recommend visiting it if you're in London, and Hampstead Heath, is that building is actually made of concrete, and they cladded it with bricks to make it look like, or look as nice as the other buildings and houses in the neighborhood.
Is this the building why Ian Fleming named afterwards Goldfinger? Because this was in Hampstead.
Yeah. And this was also super interesting in the line of the research that I was doing about all of these great tortured geniuses and thinkers. When we went on the tour, you find out, and I knew before, that the Bond villain, Ian Fleming's Bond villain, is actually named after Erno Goldfinger. And then there's like a platitude of myths as to like why that is. But you learn that Erno Goldfinger was friends with Max Ernst, with Henry Moore, with like this whole circuit of people, which felt and has all of his works inside the house. And I had this very hermetic feeling of this world that they had built that was very, it might sound very obvious, but very exclusive. But to the extent that even I, as an artist, really kind of revel in these stories of how horrible they were to each other and like how kind of brutal they were in that way. And this then really sold this apartment as the location or the setting where this architect should live.
I already mentioned the animation, which I think are quite important parts of the video, and there is this the mom of the actor who is animated bird, and I think somehow it suggests to see that every utopian is a fiction. Would you suggest that in that film, or is any utopian a fiction, or
is the bird?
Yeah. Because she's always talking about the projection, about what she's thinking.
Oh, the actress.
Yeah.
The actress. Yeah, I mean, she really symbolizes this question of like being trapped in a copy of yourself. And like my interest in an artist like Elaine Sturtevant and the idea of simulacra and like a copy having its own inherent properties. And then I used to be an actress. I trained as an actress for 15 years. And I do understand the innate weirdness of like your own image being disseminated, but it no longer belonging to you. And I've worked with this before in a video called Hyperlinks, where I made a digital copy of an actor who had recently deceased and kind of dealt with his kind of anguish over his responsibility towards the original when he himself was absolutely not the original. But then in terms of like a utopian fiction, I mean, fiction is always something that I've been drawn to because it is a way for me as a non-expert, as an amateur, to kind of allow multiple questions to exist within a framework without any kind of responsibility to like explain what architecture is to the audience, but really to use that and to use things like the failure of certain things, so the dystopian aspect as a starting point as opposed to an end point. I mean, I would 100% not say that there is any kind of utopia by the end of this, but the idea is rather than going towards a perfect solution, and this is something that another character called the time traveler, who used to live in the building but now is outside of the building, talks about this fantasy of either a utopia or a dystopia, and again the impossibility of that, and how the end is remote but fixed, and that this is thankless, and that it's a very slow process. And then this who's the actress that we've been talking about, at some point she says hope is a kind of resistance, but it's also exhausting. So it was sort of a way to be very honest about like, okay, Amos, the architect, has presented this utopia, but then the tenants also want this. But the reality of that is far, far more complicated than being just having a genius sort of, make this, concrete structure.
I really liked that Sand and Hope is the act of resistance, because I thought that somehow going back to this utopic ideas, which somehow ended in a lot of deep topics, or dystopics ideas, is maybe it's better to have an idea than having not even an idea about the future. And is it...
Or maybe it's time to accept that a utopia might not be possible, and then what do you do? I mean, this was also kind of like after this series of horrendous elections and constantly being depressed is like, and the reality of if you are suffering, you no longer want to suffer. So what do you do then? How do you move on? Like, how do you begin, not to provide an answer, because I don't think that that's something that I am capable of doing or coming up with, but what does that look like? And what does it look like? And I was very strategic in like the casting and like because there's a distinct power shift in the video from Amos, the architect, who originally is the protagonist, to the tenants themselves becoming, taking over the narrative. And that to me is the most positive thing I can think of, is like the moment that the power starts to shift and you start to really feel that tidal wave happening, but also to accept that that's not the moment of relief. That's not the joy. That's not the reward. You're not even there yet. That's just the beginning, in a way.
But isn't it that because in the former works you always were so much into technologies, now this going back is like really, okay, we have this technology, we have to think about what they do, and it's still, I think...
We have this technology and it's not working. Something has gone wrong.
Yeah, but we are still here and we are still living in architecture. We're still having this this real life which is forced by space or politics, and I'm quite happy that somehow this movie ends with this act of resistance, because you see the flowers who may be terrorists in the airplanes and trying to bring back the hope or to resist to what's going on. And I think this is, I really feel it with a lot of artists now, that this is important. And I think it's, I'm quite happy to feel that in a lot of works.
Well, the final image is of the flowers. Sorry, guys, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it again. Is of them turning, they're in the plane, because I wanted it to be obvious that they were not a figment of the secretary that they live with's imagination, because you mostly get to know their story through her up until that point. So they're on a plane and they're leaving and they turn to the camera and give the peace sign. Yeah, just because I had to end it in a way also so that there could be another episode. But like, yeah, that just made me want to make another episode in a way.
And maybe that's the last question, and then we can open it up. Maybe you have also some question is, so you already said it a bit, but what is going to be the second and the third? It's going to be 3 parts altogether?
3 episodes, yeah.
You already know?
Kind of, but I haven't made it yet.
Okay, then we are curious to see the next parts, and maybe you have some questions.
Thank you for that. Yeah, you were speaking about a collection of experiences rather than a collective experience, which might have been why you built the characters in the different ways that you did. Can you say a little bit more about why you chose the secretary and her backstory and why you paired that with the flowers?
Absolutely. So without explaining the story too much, in previous works I've had a specific investment in the idea of like the forgotten woman in history, like the erased woman or the invisible woman in history. And there's this secretary character in the video, which was at the very beginning of the research, was a man called Joseph Weizenbaum, who invented the first emotional artificial intelligence, so to speak, called Eliza, who was a Rogerian therapist that you could talk to, and she would ask you questions, and you would go through your emotional state. And she was not really an intelligence, it was just like an algorithmic pattern matching system. And Joseph Weizenbaum's secretary famously now knew this. She knew how the machine worked. And there's this anecdote that I've seen in so many different documentaries that's tossed around always by a computer scientist, usually male, about her becoming so invested in this artificial intelligence that she actually asked her boss to leave the room so that she could have a moment of privacy and intimacy with the machine. And this then changed the course of Joseph Weizenbaum's career, and he started talking about the vulnerability of humans towards machines. But then that immediately gets cut, and the secretary sort of reveals, like, I don't know if that's what really happened. Like, I was there, and maybe I did have a weird relationship with the machine. Like, maybe I smelled bad, maybe he smelled bad. Like, who knows? I just wanted a break. And so it becomes clear that she does not have control over her narrative. And she's taken in these 3 flowers, and she says that there's something inherently tragic about them that she's drawn to. And then when they leave and they make this, like, as she calls it, a strong choice, she becomes very excited at the idea of inserting herself in this new narrative and her chance to really put herself in that. And this was something like, if I'm going to be talking about feminism, I have to recognize white feminism in the 60s and 70s, and the moment at which feminism was telling civil rights activists, like, you can't be a part of our narrative because it makes our narrative too complicated, but also at the same time, the moment where that really shifted, because they realized that, like, they could add value to their, I mean, this has been well documented, they could add value to their story through the suffering of others. And again, sorry, spoiler alert, there is a moment where she reaches a kind of crisis where she's like, and she says, and these 3 flowers are really like, are the scrappy group of rebels who will fight this empirical force, and I am their den mother. And then a voice interrupts and says, hang on a minute. So their pain gives meaning to your pain, which makes you feel better. And I just thought, like, this character for me was a very important way to kind of deal with a trajectory that I've been on for a while, dealing with the very important issue of invisibility, but also to start to complicate that for myself and really start to question my own responsibility within that, if that makes sense.
no question or any other question. Then I would like to thank you for your patience, and thank you, Cécile,
Thanks
for your
for
time.
having me.
Yeah. And yeah, thank you.